Museums, a culture of theft. In this video, we'll be looking at how museums have obtained their antiquities and how sometimes those purchases weren't always in the up and up. Now, in this video, I will be relying a lot on a video made by John Oliver and my personal opinions. So if you disagree, please let me know in the comments.
If you go to Greece, you might go to the Acropolis Museum, and while you're marvelling at sculptures that are over 2 millennia old, you might notice some odd details like this sculpture, which appears to have a white foot, or this one, where someone's whole upper half seems to be suddenly and overwhelmingly white. It's what's known in the art world as Season 2 of The Wire. Well, there is an explanation for where those missing pieces are, and as a British person, I'm a little bit implicated.
So the darker stone is the original, whereas this white plaster, that represents what's in the British Museum?
Yes, exactly.
And here it is, in the British Museum. The missing marble head and chest floating in a display space.
Yep, we took it.
So, as we heard, one of the many tactics that the British Museum acquires some of its artifacts is blatant theft. So in this clip, you saw that some of the items, some of the artifacts in the British Museum were part of the Elgin collection, so named after Thomas Bruce, 7th Earl of Elgin, and is now held at the British Museum. This collection is composed of 21 figures, around half of what was at the Acropolis of Athens, which at the time was a part of the Ottoman Greece Empire. This removal occurred in between 1801 to 1812 at the Erechon. Pardon me if I mispronounce. You guys know how bad I am with name. The Temple of Athena, Nike, and Propylaea, parts of the Acropolis. This 21 figures represent around half of what was at the Acropolis of Athens. In 1983, of course, the Greek government requested the return of these statues and made that request to the UNESCO World Heritage and argued that these statues were obtained illegally or in an unethical manner. The museum and British government, of course, countered that this was not the case. Also, that the artifacts allow the museum to enhance its ancient collections, and without them, the world culture section of the museum would be deficient in its presentation and understanding of the world culture and history of humankind.
No wonder that some are now taking matters into their own hands.
In June, a Congolese activist removed a 19th century Chadian funeral pole from the Quai Branly Museum in Paris as part of a protest campaign against plundering during the colonial era.
Yeah, that happened. And obviously, that man was unaware of the museum's very clear policy: no stealing African antiquities, starting now.
So as you can see, there has been many different forms of protest against many museums still having artifacts in their collections that many people believe do not belong to that museum and or country. In the video, John Oliver talks about the Benin collection, which was essentially a large collection of African artifacts from what is now Nigeria that were essentially looted after a particular war in the country and brought to the British Museum. And you'll see that one of the leaders of the country speaking about how those artifacts are part of their cultural history that they can never regain again. These are unique items that detail the history of their people and were actually in a specific order that were no longer taught because many of the individuals who had those artifacts are no longer alive, and those artifacts, when they were brought back to the British Museum, were put in any kind of order. So now you have a history of a people that's basically erased, and they cannot connect to it also because now many Africans cannot afford to go to London, England to visit the British Museum. So not only is there a historical disconnect, but there is a physical disconnect as well, as the items are no longer in Africa. In fact, John Oliver speaks of a particular statistic showing that over 90% of African artifacts are no longer on the continent of Africa and are actually spread out throughout across the world, including Europe and, of course, North America. So this is obviously a major cultural and historical travesty to the continent, as the people themselves cannot connect with their own history. John Oliver in the video also continues to say that one other way that the British Museum, amongst other museums, tries to acquire their artifacts, in particular their ancient artifacts, is through legal means by purchasing items that are up for sale. And to do so, obviously, not only does the museum have to have the funds, but the artifacts in question have to have what's called provenance. So provenance are documents that show the history of the artifact, who made it, who's purchased it, etc., etc. Right? So it's basically a detailed history of the artifact. So this shows that at times, at least, the British Museum tries to do things above board. But even then, a lot of these paperworks can be forged, can be fudged, can be basically fake, right? So even then, the British Museum doesn't always do things above board. In fact, in the video, he speaks of many particular artifacts where the provenance documents were completely forged, or they didn't have it at all, but said, yeah, we have it, it's all good, we have it, when in reality they didn't, and had to produce a forged document themselves in order to prove that they acquired the artifact in question in a legal manner. So there are different ways for the British museums to obtain the artifacts, but not always in the best of light. Now, obviously, these days, at the very least, the British Museum, amongst other museums, really try to avoid going through the whole looting and flat out stealing the artifacts, but does try to have legal manners of obtaining the artifacts that it finds. And one of the most common ways to do this is simply by doing basically rentals of the artifacts. So this is when you'll have temporary exhibits at the museum, right? And you'll see that I've posted many videos where I just went to this particular exhibit and saw this and saw that. So that's what I'm talking about here, are these exhibits that might be at the museum for a month, for 2 months, for 3 months, and then the artifacts involved in that exhibit go on to another museum and another one and another one, etc. So what would happen in these cases is that the museum that is purchasing the rental pays a certain amount of money to the museum or even country of origin to have the artifacts temporarily in the museums, but the ownership of the artifacts remain with the museum or institution of origin, and the British Museum or other museums do not stake any claim of ownership of the items. So they're basically coming into a agreement of rental. So they're renting the artifacts temporarily, and they're spending fees for that. So obviously you'll have, things like, Picasso exhibits or Van Gogh exhibits, etc. You name it, there's, probably even a temporary exhibit about it. So basically what happens is that this allows museums to display artifacts that they don't have, or that they don't have everything in their museums, while still respecting ownership of the artifacts, and without having to necessarily worry about as well keeping the items, because obviously once a museum purchases an item and decides that we want to keep it at the museum, they also have to worry about archiving the item, maintenance, obviously paying for security, etc. So there's all these other details that come into play when you decide to purchase an item for a museum. While as if you're just keeping it temporarily, the money that you spend to rent the artifacts in that temporary exhibit covers for insurance, for installation, for removal, etc., etc. And then once the exhibit is done, the artifacts are no longer your problem, no longer your issue, and it becomes the issue of the next museum or gallery that has it. And that the only museum that has a permanent issue with how the artifacts are being handled is the Museum of Origin, so the one that is actually loaning the artifacts in question. And obviously in these kinds of scenarios, the museum that's being loaned the items does have to prove that they are a legitimate museum. They have to show that, hey, there's an actual interest in the artifacts, because obviously in some of these cases, these exhibits are, several hundreds of dollars or several thousands of dollars to have. So obviously they're not going to have an exhibit that might cost, let's say fictitious, I'm making up a number here, that might cost them $10,000 if they only see that they're going to potentially make $1,000 of quote unquote profit. So they're selling $1,000 worth of tickets for the exhibit, meaning that they have a net loss of $9,000. The museum is obviously going to have this $10K exhibit if they see that they're going to make at least $10,000 or more. So there has to be a major interest for them to decide to buy or rent these products, I should say, these artifacts. But conversely as well, the British Museum also lends out artifacts for individual artifacts for an exhibit, or creates these exhibits that can be loaned out to other museums. So as we see, many museums have a history of collecting artifacts in questionable fashions. Now what do we do? Many museums have put in place measures where they plan on returning some or all of the artifacts that have been proven to be stolen or obtained in questionable fashion, but many refuse to do so. Others have decided to wait until they've been requested to return the items. Is this acceptable? Should museums keep all the artifacts that they've obtained, regardless of how, when, etc.? Should they return all, even if they're not asked to, or should they wait? Now, obviously, there's no one way to do things. Personally, I think if they're asked to return items and it's proven that these items were obtained in illicit or unethical fashions, then they should be returned. However, what I would suggest is perhaps make copies of the artifacts being returned. That way the originals can be returned to their rightful owners, but there's still going to be copies that can be used used for research purposes to present to customers who want to see these artifacts and may not be able to go to the country of origin, etc. Another way to do it is something that I mentioned earlier in the video, which is having temporary exhibits, right? So if we returned, for example, all the mummies and Egyptology artifacts to Egypt, Egypt can then loan out these artifacts at a fee to various museums. That way, these artifacts can go from city to city, country to country, to be appreciated by everybody and not just people that happen to go to England to view the British Museum or to any other museum that they might be able to go to, etc. So those are two ways that we can ensure that everybody has access to the knowledge of the world and to the experience of our past. Because we realize that, for example, I just mentioned Egyptology. It is something that obviously pertains to the people of Egypt, but we understand and know that the history of Egypt has influenced many cultures, both ancient and modern. So having access to this knowledge is not only important to Egyptians themselves, but to us as well. And being able to make sure that everybody has a fair chance to learn and to view these artifacts is just as important as making sure that the Egyptian people and government have their artifacts back. Now, obviously, I just use Egypt as an example. It could be the Indian people, it could be Native Americans, whatever the situation might be. Now, obviously, we do need to make sure that these artifacts were indeed stolen or obtained in some unethical manner. There are many examples, unfortunately, where forgers do the reverse, where they try to illegally obtain things that were not theirs to begin with. So we do need to make sure that if we are going to return a particular item, that it gets returned to the right people at the right time. I've heard stories as well. Now, these are things that I can't factually back up, where things and artifacts were returned to people and then turned right around, and those artifacts end up right back on the market being sold and resold over and over again. So you do want to make sure that if you are going to return an item, they're going to go back to the right people at the right time in the right way. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or issues or anything else, please leave me a comment, leave me a like. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe.